Back in Missouri, I consider Missouri kind of the Garden of Eden of grazing. I moved to Idaho almost 20 years, April 1st. It'll be 20 years that I've been gone from Missouri. Doesn't seem that long, but I tell people everywhere, if my life's ambition were just to be in the cow business, I never would have left Missouri. The move to Idaho was a recreational lifestyle move. And it just happened I ended up running one unit of a larger ranch out there for 19 years. We actually moved off of that property this spring to another location. There's a difference between drought and it being dry. Where we moved to, the natural precipitation is between 7 and 8 inches. A drought is when you only get 3 inches. It's just dry. And it's amazing what I learned about grazing by moving out of this, Garden of Eden, Missouri environment. I know some years it doesn't seem like the Garden of Eden, but by and large, it's a great place to be in the country. But what I learned about grazing management, working in the desert, really helps you understand how to approach drought in a high rainfall environment like this. And similarly, this was a high rainfall environment, and I thought I was doing a pretty good job of managing the water cycle, and I understood things about water, but going and working with the magic of center pivot irrigation, where as long as the equipment runs, I make it rain 3/4 of an inch every 3 days. It's amazing. And I'm pretty confident that were I to come back to Missouri, and we were already running at a much higher than typical stocking rate on our farm in North Missouri, I'm pretty sure I could up the stocking by another 30 to 40% because of what I've learned working in the desert and working with irrigation. So there has been a lot of drought going around the country the last few years, and sometimes we think that, man, it's just getting worse. These droughts come more often, they're worse than anything I can remember, and I believe that to a certain extent. I don't know whether it's necessarily always true. I think everybody's probably seen a map like this that shows as you go from east to west in the U.S., it gets drier. Missouri's kind of near the center of the state. That white strip down the center, that's 25 to 30 inch annual precipitation, and we generally think of west of there as being rangeland and drier, and east of there being pasture and being wetter. I want to talk a little bit about what constitutes a drought. That might seem kind of basic and simplistic, but when we think about our productivity and carrying capacity and how it relates to water, there's some things we need to understand. So you go online and you look at weather records, they're going to give you an average. And what the average rainfall is, it's just the numeric average of a whole bunch of years. What's interesting is that normal rainfall and average are not the same thing. In a continental climate like where we are, 7 out of 10 years, you will have below average rainfall. That's what's normal. It takes just a few big precipitation years to skew that average up. And that might be 1 year in 10, maybe 2 years in 10, that you get those big wet years, or at least that's what I thought it was. And then that offsets, the few dry years, and you end up with something called normal. Normal is generally 10 to 15% below the long-term average. So rather than, if it says your average precipitation is 38 to 40 inches, which is what we were up in North Missouri, your normal rainfall is probably going to be closer to like 34, 35, something like that. We talk about droughts in the Midwest here, and usually they're just a few months. Out west where we are now, they can be 3 to 7 years of drought before you break out of it. Then there's that last question here. If you are in a high rainfall environment where it generally rains 3 to 5 inches, maybe 4 to 7 inches every month, if you go 1 month without rain, is that a drought? I don't know. So, like everything, there are official definitions of what a drought is. SRM, the Society for Range Management, and they have a terminology glossary or handbook that everything we talk about in grazing, they've got a definition for it. And so there's that long list description of what a drought is. What I generally say is if you have anything less than 75% of normal precipitation, you're in a drought. And whether that is in a month's time, 3 months' time, 6 months' time, a year's time, that's how my mind works when describing a drought. We can, of course, go online to the drought monitor and see what's happening all around the country. And this is the October 26th drought monitor. And there is good old Missouri. We can zoom in there. Good old Missouri. Go just to that state. And I haven't been here, all summer, but it kind of looks like maybe it's been dry in Missouri for a little while. Some places drier than others. I was trying to, is this Osage County here? Somewhere in here is where we are today. Somewhere in there is where we are today. And it says it's on the dry side. So yeah, you got a drought going on. Is it going to get better? Is it going to get worse? Well, we have all of this good information, forecasting information now. We can just go another click down in the drought monitor. And so this is the drought outlook. This is valid for October through January of next year. Here again we are in Missouri. And that light gray says drought remains but improves. There's a little bit of the greener color that's drought removal likely. So this suggests maybe it's going to get better. And this is the thing about drought. It always gets better for some people, but not for everybody. Now eventually it gets better for everybody, but the variability of rainfall makes different localities a little different. So again, there is so much stuff, on the internet that I think most of this is honest data. I don't think anybody's fabricating this to try to trick us into something. Half of the internet, that's what it is. Just bullshit trying to trick us into something. But, so I thought that droughts are getting worse. This here goes from 1895 to 2022. These are Palmer modified drought indices. If it's green and above that baseline, it's a wetter year. If it's yellow and below that line, it's a droughtier year. Are we having the worst droughts we have ever had? Absolutely not. The 1930s and 1950s, much worse than anything we've seen so far in the 21st century. If you look at the frequency at which drought occurred from about 1915 to 1970, there's as many or more dry years as wet years. But if we look, basically from the year 2000 on average, if anything, we've been wetter. We've had a few dry years, but they've not been horrible. Why does it seem like it's getting worse? See, this is data that I don't think is lying to us. I think this is a representation of really going on. So I think the answer to that question is, for some of us, the localized pattern has been severe. But we look at it on a statewide basis, and it says, no, it's not. You know what that means? That means that every individual's response to the drought is going to be different. We can look at stuff like this and say, well, on average, it's a pretty good place to be. But at your local level, it might not be. And we're going to go down that path of talking about what makes it a little bit different. All right, so meat is Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas. When I was with the university here in Missouri, we did a lot of four-state educational projects and some cooperative research things, and we called that the meat group. And this here, standardized precipitation index, that's what you're looking at on that Palmer graph. It's how many units of variation was this drought away from the norm. That's basically what this is. 50% of the years, there is no drought in this region. Now, that doesn't mean 1 year, nobody in the four-state region has a drought. It just means on average across the region, we had a good year. That happens 50% of the time. We have a mild drought 34% of the time. When you add those together, that says 84% of the time, 5 out of 6 years, we should expect to have a decent amount of precipitation. Why does it seem that we don't? I don't know. And then you can see it goes moderate, severe, extreme. They talk about the drought of the century. Well, this is the drought of approximately 40 to 50 years. Every 40 to 50 years, you expect to have an extreme drought. Does everybody in the state have that same extreme drought? No, they don't. Some of us have a good year, the same year that somebody else is dry as a bone. Once again, emphasizing that we all have to have our individual drought response plan for our particular property. The only thing we can manage is what happens on our particular property. We can't manage the weather. We can't pick up our farm and move it over to this place where it rains a little more frequently. And you can pull out this stuff for 6 different sub-regions of Missouri. And these two patterns look pretty similar. This is the western Ozarks. This is the northeastern Prairie. Back in the day, droughts were a little more severe in west Missouri than they were in the northeast. But I look at that, and it says really we're about the same. But you know what? Year in, year out, from a standpoint of not having drought risk, I'd rather be up in the northeast corner of the state than I would on the western plains out there. It just seems like it's always a little better in northeast Missouri than it is, Sedalia to Kansas City and Bolivar and places like that. All right, so that's the background information now of where droughts take place, how frequent they are, what's the severity. Now this one here, is Missouri getting wetter or drier? This is the change so we have 1920 to 1979, and then 1980 to 2009. The darker the green here, the greater the percentage increase in annual precipitation has been. If it's these lighter colors, it's actually been getting drier. You'll see in the entire Midwest region, we have a little bit of stuff on the plains area out here. We have, I don't know what's going on in upstate Michigan up here, but you look at most of the Midwest, and it has gotten wetter over the last 50 years, not drier. Missouri, it's kind of been, a 3 to 6% increase, so it's not a huge change. But we don't have to believe that it's the end of the world because the droughts are getting worse and worse and more frequent. At least in the Midwest, they're not, and in Missouri, they certainly aren't. It's perspective. Okay, so with that information behind us, I want to start talking about what can we do to make our places more drought resilient. Carrying capacity is the ability of your farm or ranch to produce feed so that you can graze livestock on it. And improving the carrying capacity of your property through management is one of the best ways that there is to increase the profitability of your property. So stocking rate is the number of animals that we put on the property. Carrying capacity is the supply side of the equation. Stocking rate is the demand side of the equation. Stocking rate is generally considered one of the primary drivers of profitability because basically the more animals you have on the place, the greater the revenue stream potentially can be. So we want to be able to increase our stocking rate, and we do that by building more carrying capacity in our land. So a lot of people think that where you live is the sole determinant of the carrying capacity of your property. This is the ranch unit in Idaho that we manage. This is 5 miles down the road. We have the first water right out of Pasture Creek. They have the first water right out of Falls Creek. We are sprinkler irrigated. They are sprinkler irrigated. One thing about sprinklers, the whole idea of sprinklers is you apply water at the rate that the soil can infiltrate it. If you see water running on the surface of a sprinkler irrigated pasture, there's something wrong with your water cycle. Oh, but we don't irrigate here. Okay, if you see rainfall running off across the surface of your pasture, there's something not right. You got a dysfunctional water cycle. So drought management and drought resilience starts from the standpoint of how do I create a more functional water cycle on my property. The amount of rainfall that you get and the length of your growing season, that sets the upper limit of carrying capacity. Okay? And there's a few other factors that come in, soil type, past management, but by and large, your potential for production is dictated by the amount of water in the environment and how long is your growing season. Your carrying capacity, though, is actually determined by your grazing management. Of that production potential, how much are you capturing, harvesting with your livestock? That determines your true carrying capacity. So we have the opportunity, regardless of the environment that we're in, to improve our carrying capacity. You see all that grass there? We carry twice the number of animal units on this property as they do down there. Spatial-based management, this is set stocking. They just put cattle out on that pasture in the spring and leave them there till it's gone, literally. Our management is largely based on managing time. We are all about length of the grazing period, duration of the recovery period. We manage based on time. Your neighbors mostly manage based on space. Your neighbors run out of grass, have a poor water cycle. If you're doing effective grazing, it's a completely different picture. I do not have actually I do have pictures. I was going to say side-by-sides like this in Missouri of our property in Lynn County and the neighbor's property. But those pictures were all taken in the days of 35mm slides, not a digital camera. And unfortunately, I haven't converted everything to digital. So I have wonderful pictures similar to this from the Missouri environment, but I took them so long ago, they're in an unusable format. Plus, I don't know where they are. This is one of the most obvious statements that I can make. Water makes grass grow. Water makes grass grow. It's that simple. Now, this particular table, this is a standard table for predicting forage yield based on the precipitation regime. And this one is for 32 to 42 degrees latitude. All right, so we have the amount of precipitation, and you need to think about this as effective precipitation. And they're in 5-inch increments. Then we have the expected growth. This is pounds of dry matter yield per inch of water received, and you will notice that the yield per inch of water steadily increases as we get more water in the environment up to a point. And beyond a certain amount of water, the yield just begins to fall off because you got too many days of the soil being saturated, not enough sunlight, stuff like that, too much water will restrict your productivity. For 42 to 49 degrees, we use a different table. It ends at 30 inches. There's lots of irrigation research from the West where it's properly timed water applications that says there is no advantage to any water beyond 30 inches. There's parts of Missouri that get 48, 50 inches. There's no value to that extra water. Why? Because it's hard for the soil to infiltrate and hold that. A moderate amount of water is more productive than an excessive amount of water. All right, so if we just take and multiply the amount of water times the yield per inch, we get the potential yields in those areas. We have the appropriate utilization rate for that precipitation regime, and this is seasonal, not temporal, and we end up with what the expected yield of that pasture is. I emphasize we need to think about this as effective precipitation, because even though the average precipitation where we were in Missouri was 38 to 40 inches, so that would have put us into this highest yielding category, does all of that 38 to 40 inches of water get into the soil? No. Does it stay in the soil? No. Does it fall at a time of year when we have temperatures that support active plant growth? No. So even though we were in a 38 to 40 inch environment, our effective precipitation is probably back here at 25 to 30. Now, let's think about your neighbors who aren't doing an effective job of grazing management, and it rains and their ponds fill up in a hurry because of the runoff, and a lot of water goes down to the creek. They might be in a 38 to 40 inch rainfall environment, but what's their effective precipitation? It might be clear back here at 15 to 20, and so rather than getting, that 4 or 5 ton yield, they're getting a couple tons because of their grazing management. So the way you make your farm more drought resilient is you improve the water cycle. Building organic matter, adding carbon to the soil is the most powerful tool that we have for increasing the water holding capacity of the soil. In a clay soil, it's how we also modify the structure of the soil to increase the infiltration of water, into a clay soil. One of the things that I failed to do when I was here in Missouri and we developed the grazing school and we were teaching the grazing school, we did not put near enough emphasis on managing the water cycle, on improving soil water holding capacity. I had to go to the desert to learn that lesson, and I got it now. And when I said I'm confident I can come back to Missouri and increase our stocking rate or carrying capacity by 30 to 40%, that is almost entirely based on changing how we would manage the water cycle. All right, so evapotranspiration is the term we use to describe water use from a pasture, range, or a crop, or a lawn, or anything. It's the combination of water directly evaporating from the soil surface, that's the evapo, and then transpiration is the metabolic use of water by plants. The way I often express it is transpiration grows cow food, evaporation does not. If we have a good, healthy plant community that's covering the soil, it's keeping the soil much cooler, it is stopping direct sunlight from hitting the soil and boiling water out of it. So when we have a good, green, healthy landscape cover, we have a lot of water available for transpiration, growing cow food, and we lose minimal amount of water due to evaporation. When the ground, I'm going to push the button too hard. When the ground dries out and we don't have the green living plant there metabolizing, and we have sunlight directly hitting the soil, we greatly increase the evaporative loss of water, leaving much less water available to support plant growth. Don't grow cow food, grow cow food. Keeping the ground covered, appropriate post-grazing residual, developing litter on the soil surface, those are the keys to improving the water cycle. Now, what happens in drought sometimes, your neighbors, they just leave the cattle out there. Now, they might start feeding them hay, but cattle will almost always prefer to graze rather than eat from a hay bale. And if you're not watching what's going on and you leave the livestock out on a pasture in a drought, they chew down every sprig of green grass, but they also start licking the litter from the soil surface. Now, I think that is probably a little bit more of a problem as we move west from here and get into the drier environments, but I have absolutely seen it in Missouri, other parts of the Midwest, in the eastern states, where people fail to destock in response to a drought, leave the cattle out there, oh, I'm feeding them hay so they'll be okay, and you end up just completely degrading the whole surface of the soil so that when it does rain again, you get excessive runoff rather than infiltration. So the real keys, you've got to leave living plant material out there growing. So let's think about what happens when we have a drought. If you have been doing an effective job of grazing management and you have built your litter layer, you have built organic matter, and a drought comes, what we see, if your precipitation is 25% below normal, you'll see about a 25% reduction in yield. Why? Because water makes grass grow. So in a healthy, functional pasture setting, the reduction in yield from a drought is basically just proportional to the reduction in rainfall. Okay? If we have a pasture that has been severely overgrazed prior to the drought, that's been the historic use, so it has a dysfunctional water cycle. We have that 25% reduction in precipitation, but we might see up to and in excess of a 50% reduction in yield because the soil has no capacity to infiltrate the little rain shower we might get, and it has minimal capacity to store water. If we leave the animals out there, it was abusive grazing before the drought, and we leave them out there, even if we're feeding them hay, 25% reduction in precipitation can give us 50 to 75% reduction in dry matter yield. That's how important our ongoing management is to the responsiveness of our pastures. We'll look at these three scenarios and think about what happens when it does start raining. If we have managed the pasture in a healthy way, destocked or put the animals into a sacrifice area to feed them, it starts raining, we left the litter cover out there, we left the residual out there, it's going to recover quite quickly. We might see an increase in, annual grasses out there, and those might be cool season, they might be warm season, just depends on the time of the year. Shallow-rooted perennials, they're going to be weakened, but your deep-rooted perennials, they'll recover quite quickly. Deep-rooted perennials, the native warm season grasses, tall fescue, a lot of our legumes, a lot of our forbs, they will come back quickly if we have left their roots in a healthy state. Where we have grazed severely prior to the drought, and we had a weakened pasture, expect a lot of increase in weeds. Some of the desirables will probably disappear or maybe be weakened for years, and even the deep-rooted perennials will be slow to recover. Why? Because if we were severely grazing, they aren't nearly as deep-rooted as they potentially could be. So they're not exploring a full profile for water like those plants would do in a healthier situation. And then if you have severely grazed prior to the drought and continued through the drought, significant increase in weed presence, reduction in the desirable species out there. It's going to take a lot longer for that pasture to recover and be to a healthy grazing condition again. And if it's too long and you have no revenue, you spent too much money buying hay to feed those animals through the drought, then you lose the farm. Drought is a serious deal, but we can do a lot to protect ourselves from it, not just by buying that, insurance program they have now, but by managing our landscape more effectively. When I say it's a longer recovery period, what does that mean? Some people want me to give them a number of days. It isn't the number of days, it is the response of the plant. On most cool season grasses, what we are looking for to say that it has recovered from the drought and we're ready to graze again, we have to have at least 3 new fully developed leaves on that till. On the native warm season grasses, we want it to be 4 to 5 leaves that are out there. In the spring of a good growing season, a cool season grass like orchard grass or fescue, timothy, they'll put out a new leaf every 5 to 7 days. You get deeper into summer, it's hotter, it's not raining as much, it might be 2 to 3 weeks that they put out a leaf. So what that says, in spring in really good conditions, the recovery period might and be appropriately recovered in terms of carbohydrate balance in the plant. It can happen in as little as 15 to 20 days in good growing conditions with a cool season grass. But that's based on the 5 to 7 day leaf emergence. If it's taking 2 to 3 weeks to get there, then we're looking at 6 to 9 weeks, 45, 55, 65, 70 days is how long the recovery is going to be. Warm season grasses at their peak growth rate, native grasses, will be 7 to 10 days to put a leaf out. And so that's 40 to 50 days minimal recovery. And very often we're going to do more. But one of the first things you need to get out of your head is that it is some magical number of days. It is not a magical number of days. It is how has the plant responded. There's something we call drought plans. Now, we do a lot more drought plans in the West than we do in the Midwest. But it's perfectly reasonable in a place like this that you actually have a formal written drought plan. I'll talk a little bit about key components in it. And a quick trigger. Okay, so that's where we're supposed to be. A lot of you have probably heard of Bud Williams. Some of you may even have been to one of his stockmanship schools or a marketing school. But in his marketing school, Bud talks about the 3 inventories that we have to manage. That's the grass inventory, our capital resources, and the livestock inventory. And these are the key concepts. Available feed. You can't ever have too much grass. Capital. You can't ever have too much capital. Livestock, it is very easy to have too many of these. And another thing that Bud said is ranchers love cows, hate grass. They try to buy every cow the fence will hold and then get rid of every blade of grass inside that fence. And that is the difference in being focused on just the livestock rather than all of these things. So if you have some extra forage available on your place, you have opportunities. If every day of the year you're chasing grass, trying to find grass somewhere, you're always going to have challenges. If you find yourself in that situation, it's simply a matter of your stocking rate is exceeding carrying capacity. You are putting more livestock grazing demand on the land than what the land can support. Inventory management. You got to reduce the livestock inventory to protect the grass inventory. If you have capital, you have opportunities. It's a good growing season. Suddenly it's not a drought anymore, it's a good growing season. And if you have some extra capital, you can buy more livestock than capitalize on that good year. You lease more land, buy in feed, you can go to Vegas. All of those are opportunities when you have extra capital. And back to our situation with the neighbors, because I spy on them. Another great thing about satellite imagery and stuff like this, you know, I know how big their fields are. I can count the number of cows out there. I know when they put them out there, when they take them off. I know more about, in terms of land productivity, AUDs, animal unit days per acre harvested, I know more about what the neighbors are getting than they know. So in this situation like this, they're producing and harvesting about 120 to 140 animal unit days per acre. Our 18-year average at Patterson was 242 AUDs per acre. In our best year, we were 318. Management based on space, management based on time. So when you switch away from a mindset that you're only managing, you know, this area and you put this many animals out there, and change it to, we will graze this area for this bit of time with these animals. We'll graze this area for this amount of time. When you change to time-based management, the whole dynamics of the soil, plant, animal interface change in a positive way. So the way that we monitor the supply side of the equation, that's our carrying capacity, is through a pasture inventory system. In productive environments, I do this every 2 weeks. I used to do this in Missouri, not in as formal a way. I did a lot of stuff in my head then. You know, I'd go through our pastures every 2 to 3 weeks, and there on the farm at Linnaeus, we had 76 permanent paddocks fenced out there. So I'd look at every one of them and say, okay, I got 2 days here, I got 2 days here, I got 3 days here, I got just 1 day there, and I just ran that tally in my head, and you know, it's adding up, and you know, I might at the end of passing over everything say, I got 72 days worth of feed. And if I had 72 days worth of feed, I had a lot of flexibility. We could actually get some additional stock if we wanted. I could do, and forgive me for saying this, I could make hay. And I did, you know, back in the days before, you know, we learned how to balance everything better. Yeah, I made hay. I loved making hay. I just found it was unaffordable. So I wrote a book about it, if you didn't know. Okay, so in Missouri, I did it that way, just kind of tallied how much feed do I have in front of me. When I went into the consulting business, I needed to have a little more formal structure to do it, so we developed tools for recording pasture inventory, projecting feed supplies, and all that sort of thing. You don't have to worry about this monthly on rangeland. That's when you get less than 20 inches annual precipitation. I guess there's some years, some people in Missouri have rangeland because they got less than 20 inches. Okay, but we did it every 2 weeks. And by doing it every 2 weeks, we have an ongoing measure of what our feed supply is, but more importantly, we can predict, I think actually that will come up. So what the pasture inventory is, the way I do it, it's just a visual assessment of available feed. And I express that as AUDs per acre, animal unit days. When I was in Missouri, I didn't even know what an animal unit day was. I had a vague idea what the concept was and what an animal unit month is. You go out west and deal with public land grazing, and the ranch we were on ran on about 130,000 acres of public land, besides the irrigated stuff. But an animal unit day, all it actually is 26 pounds of dry matter forage. Technically, it's what a 1,000-pound cow at moderate production eats in a day. The actual number is 26 pounds. So you could do an inventory trying to estimate, using a grazing stick or something, how many pounds per acre of forage you have, and then you do the calculation of how many cows you could feed for a day. what my eye is trained to see now. I walk into pasture and I just see 37 animal unit days, and that's what goes into the inventory. So that's the way I did it. It's a visual assessment. We did it as the livestock base number, and every pasture that you have, even if it's just been grazed off, and you have no grazing there, well, that's a 0. It still goes into the inventory because it's how much feed do you have per acre across the farm. That's where I'm supposed to talk about visual assessment. You know, if you go somewhere and you say it with confidence, people will believe you. But what matters is, was it actually accurate? And the way you develop accuracy is by actually doing it. And I like this deal. And remember, a lot of you know me, and a lot of you, just out of curiosity, how many people here had been to the Ford Systems Research Center at Linnaeus in the time that I was there? Thank you all. And I suspect most of these people went to a grazing school there. And you remember, you probably had to clip quadrats to get the yield, put it in the bag and weigh it, dry it, all that stuff. You know, I did 22 years, 3 months on pasture research, and we literally cut tens of thousands of those quadrats. I don't need any of those tools. So I like to go to the field with no tool other than my eyeball. And I do it as animal unit days. But you know, if you want to do it as cow days and tailor it to your specific sized cow, or do it as stocker days, as if what you do is just run stockers, you can do that. So you can make it be specific to your stock. And then the way you calibrate your eyes is through the grazing records. And it's interesting, if you go out and moving cattle every day with polywire, and if you look at the field and say, I think that's 50 AUDs per acre, and you have the equivalent of 100 animal units in your herd, you just take the animal units in your herd, divide it by your estimate per acre, and that tells you how many acres you need to give it. So I got 100 animal units, I look at it and say it's 50, I set up my polywire for 2 acres. And you know what, I took my phone out of my pocket, but it is so easy to accurately measure 2 acres these days, there's no excuse not to do it. And so you come back tomorrow, if it's grazed down like that, you guessed wrong. There's only 35 out there. If it's still this tall, you guessed wrong, and oh, there were 70 out there. And so the next day you make the adjustment. If you do that 30 successive days, your eye will be statistically as accurate as any tool we use at research for measuring yield. I once took, there on the ranch in Idaho, I took a 7-year, so I have the pasture inventory estimates, I have what we actually harvested grazing-wise, and I took 7 years worth of inventory and actual grazing result data, analyzed it to determine what the standard error of estimate is. So how accurate is my eye? 4% is what my error was across 7 years of grazing data. And anybody in this room, if you decided you wanted to do it and go through that process that I described, you can get very, very accurate at assessing how much feed is out there. And this is what I just described. I'm running a slide behind. Okay, we'll go there. So what do you need to know? How many head, how long are they in the paddock, and how big is the paddock? And if you do that, you can have an ongoing assessment of what your feed supply is. Talk about a good, map with acreages measured. Again, we have so many apps in the phone. You don't do that. There are also several different grazing software packages that are available. I use one called Maya Grazing. There's Pasture Map, AgriWeb, some others there. Those would come to mind. So that's a 300 acre pivot, that's a 150 acre pivot. And when I move a herd from one place to the other, on my phone, I just drag that herd to the next paddock, and it then has calculated what my animal unit day per acre yield was. Within this app, I can do projections of feed supply forward, even to the extent that if the growth rate has slowed down, it will tell me how many animals I should ship off the place by what day to make sure that I maintain the stocking rate within the carrying capacity. So there's all kinds of great technology tools now that can help us along in this process. When I started doing this, I did it all in spreadsheets, had to create all the functions for generating the graphs and stuff. Not everybody wants to do that, but these various pasture record tools can really help make life easier. I already mentioned that, like you can see that area's grazed down pretty good. That would be a 0 in the inventory. Now, if I overgraze it, I will actually, or overly graze it too severely, I'll put a negative number in there, which means you took off too much feed, and that is going to force it to take a longer recovery period before I come back to it again. But all of these management tools are what help you keep on top of what's happening with the feed supply. If you are going into a drought situation and you can see that your overall feed supply, your feed inventory is going down, I mean, you might not even really be realizing it until you put the numbers in front of you, how fast you're losing feed supply, and say, oh man, I gotta do something. In a drought situation, at the local level, what happens if you hold on to your cows for too long and then decide to sell them? Well, everybody else has also realized, oh, cow, I'm running out of grass, I need to see cows. If you have forward planning and, particularly a graphic depiction, that really brings it home. Okay, if you got a cow-calf operation, is your herd the same weight every day? Well, you better hope not. It's got to be your total herd demand, your total feed demand's got to be going up. Otherwise, you're going to wean 182-pound calves. And weaning weight's not really important to profitability unless we're talking about 182-pound calves. Then you've got a problem. But if your demand is going up like this and it is showing your feed supply coming down like that, and you have that information ahead of everybody else, you can make your plans earlier and beat the local market crash. We also maintain a livestock inventory. That, of course, is our measure of demand. So you got to keep it current. Births and deaths of the cow-calf operation, purchases and sales, custom grazing count, all that needs to go in there. And again, in my grazing or pasture map or any of these, if you keep your livestock inventory up to date, when something dies, when something's born, when you buy in some additional cattle, that is adjusting your feed demand on an ongoing basis, and it just does a lot of the work for you to see what's going on. And again, I work with standard animal units, so I've talked to some guys and gals here, and they're running cows, they're running sheep, goats, chickens, whatever. Every one of those has some level of feed demand. If we put it for each individual animal, you just got a lot more work figuring out what the total feed demand is going to be. If the whole system is running in standard animal units, you can look at what your feed supply is and then decide how much you want to allocate to cows, how much to yearlings, how much to sheep, and that decision of who you keep around, who you ship off, should be driven by who is most likely to generate you a profit in this drought situation. And you need to know what each of those enterprises is going to use in a feed situation. So stock policy is what we call that. It is your plan for inventory, turnover, and replacement. It involves the class of livestock, the number and weight, when they're on arrive, when they ship off. Because as I said, your feed demand is not constant, just a flat number through the summer. If you're growing animals, feed demand is increasing until you ship some of those animals out, and then you drop feed demand back out. the considerations, what are your resources, profitability opportunities, and cash flow. They always say cash flow is the lifeblood of any small business. And on farms and ranch, lack of cash flow is what really limits our flexibility to do stuff. It is what drives us to sometimes make bad marketing decisions. Because, God, I just need some cash. If you have, a little stashed away, you got more flexibility. You got more options. This is one of the toughest things for some livestock producers, especially if they're in the seed stock industry, to actually accept. Ranching's a land-based business. Livestock just happens to be what we harvest it with. And one of the best ways, I don't have a slide in here, but one of the best ways to illustrate that is sometimes sit down and add up all of your land-based assets. And remember, all of that equipment is a land-based asset. I mean, what do you actually do with a cow, with a tractor and a plow? Nothing. What do you actually do with a cow, with a tractor and a hay baler? Nothing. You're doing something to the land. So all of that equipment, other than your squeeze chutes, portable corrals, things like that, almost all of our equipment is a land-based asset. The fence around it, we think about that as a cost per acre. Stock water development on it, fertilizer, seeding, all of that is land-based. And then we have the value of the livestock and the costs actually associated with them. Vet med, identification, transportation, marketing, and on most cattle operations, your land-based assets are going to be 3 to 5 times greater than your livestock-based assets. And so if you think about profitability as return on assets, you darn well better be focused on getting the return on your land assets. And if you do that, the cattle should come along for the ride. But the balance of our attention and what we're managing to get effective practice, we need to be more focused on the land. And a key part of the land is how does the water cycle function on our land? The easiest thing to change is the livestock, and there's profit per acre, not profit per head that matters. Okay, so now we'll get to an actual drought plan. And a key part of most drought plans is destocking. One of the first things, so I had my first ranching for profit exposure in either the very late 80s or the very early 90s, and that was with Stan Parsons, before Dave Pratt, and now Dallas now had it. And one of the things that I clearly remember Stan saying is you cannot cost effectively feed your way through a drought. It would take, on average, all the profits from 3 good years to pay for the added feed costs of trying to get to the drought year. And so from early on, destocking has been my state of mind. If you have a drought, you got to reduce the demand. So we need to have more than one enterprise on the place, and you want at least one of those enterprises to be something that you can liquidate very quickly. So up in Lynn County, we ran we had sheep for 9 years, and then we had, on the cattle side, we did cow-calf, kept our own wean calves over to graze as stockers, and then we would also custom graze some cattle. And first few years we did yearlings because that's what everybody did. And we found out we didn't enjoy doing yearlings very much, which is a whole bunch of other stories. And so we did cow-calf pairs, replacement heifers, cull cows, dry fall calving cows. But you want an enterprise that it's not going to hurt you a bit to get out of it earlier than what you would plan. And for us, that was usually our custom grazing deals, that or the stockers that we actually own. We would actually liquidate the stockers we actually owned ahead of doing a custom graze where we had to tell the cattle owner, hey, we can't keep them here, to the agreed endpoint time, you'll have to take them out earlier. We did, I think about really only one time that we had a cattle owner have to take stock away early, but by liquidating our own stockers, that gave him more time to find where to go with those others. But if the only enterprise that you have on your place is cow-calf, and you're trying to destock for drought management, it's a lot tougher to do it with your own cow herd than it is if you have a secondary enterprise. You don't have that. So we talked about triggers, and this is the way we would write something into a drought plan and what these percentages are and the timing. It depends on where you are. So this is just an example. But we are always monitoring precipitation. I think a very important tool that every farmer needs to have is a rain gauge, and keep your own record. Now, if you want to put 3 different automated weather stations on your property, that's totally cool, because I am a data guy, but a rain gauge, that's important. So if we have not received 70% of normal precipitation by June 10, we will destock by 40%. The date, how much you destock, and the percent, that's personal choice. Depends on the environment you're in, your personal level of risk aversion. Here's another one. All right, now, by August 1st, we've not received 50%, we fully destock. We get every animal off the place, because it's more important to protect the resource than it is the livestock on it. Yes, sir.
Stipulate that we're in a 40-inch annual rainfall area.
Mm-hmm.
We get a 5-inch rain in a 24-hour period. That's 12.5% of normal.
Yep.
How does that affect the normal rainfall?
Okay, so the question was, we live in a 40-inch rainfall environment, but sometimes that comes as a 5-inch, downpour in a 24-hour period. How do you account for that? That's what makes living in a high natural rainfall environment a little more challenging. You could look at that and just try to make your estimate of how much got into the ground, how much ran off. And if you say, my God, half that rain just ran off down the ditch, you discount 2.5 inches of that. That's a good question, because it's one of those things that comes into play a lot.
Are these recommendations for arid regions or for humid?
It could be for both. It depends on the individual and your level of risk aversion. In all of our carrying capacity calculators, we have a drought buffer percent number that you can put in there. And so rather than, if you put it in at 15%, it's going to calculate what your stocking rate should be, allowing 15% for drought buffer, not using every blade of grass that you have. In places like Missouri, I very often put that in at 0, unless somebody tells me they want 10%, 15% there. In the West, yeah, sometimes we put in a 40% drought buffer, meaning you're never going to be stocked higher than 60% of what the average potential should be. But some guys out west will say, yeah, we're better than that. Let's put that in at 50. So, but it's as a tool and as a concept, it's universally applicable. You just change the particular details to fit your environment and your level of risk aversion. Execute the plan in a timely manner. The worst thing that I see people do is they have a drought plan, they have a trigger written in, and they listen to the weather forecast and they say, well, they're giving us a 30% chance of rain next week. Let's hold on to them and see what happens. And then you're just a week deeper into it, because if you're in a drought and it's a 30% forecast, I ain't booking on it. Pull that trigger. Okay, from the plant side, graze appropriately at all times. That means shorten the grazing periods while extending the recovery period. Focus on soil health. Biologically active soils are more drought resilient, drought resistant than dead soils. build organic matter, and I don't know why it's so screwed up on the incrementally now coming in there. This last one, leave appropriate post-grazing residual at all times. Have no fear of wasting grass. Your best drought protection is your willingness to waste grass, because that's what builds the soil and protects the soil. Maintain adequate fertility and you recover more quickly. Some last things here. Build the carbon base of your soil. A 1% increase in soil organic matter increases the water storage capacity in your surface 12 inches by 1 acre inch. Building organic matter, adding carbon to the soil is hugely powerful for improving the drought resilience of your plants. We do that by optimizing photosynthesis. Now sometimes, I actually say maximize. There's very few places I ever use the word maximize. Generally it's optimize, 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 but I've yet to figure what the downside of maximizing photosynthesis is. So if there's one thing in our operation that we can think about, how do we maximize it? It is photosynthesis. More photosynthesis on every acre, the greater the production. That's plant production, animal production, and soil production. So managing leaf area, more active photosynthesis, more days of the year, huge key tool for building drought resilience. That's via the creation of organic matter. The post-grading residual, I use this set of photos in a lot of presentations. So this is a high thanks to plant community. That is a good stage for beginning grazing. Cool season grasses, this is going to be 4 to 5 leaves per tiller. Native grasses, it's going to be 5 to 8 or more leaves per tiller. If we graze it appropriately, we've left a 4 to 5 inch residual out there. Good for the plants, good for the soil, good for the livestock. If we have that fear of wasting grass and we leave them out there another day, take it down to this point, there's no residual leaf area to kick active photosynthesis back in. We have sunlight hitting the soil, evaporating water out. We have asked the animals to eat lower quality forage. So this is bad for the plants, bad for the soil, bad for the livestock. You've got to be willing to waste grass. Well, okay, appropriate recovery. This is a classic figure here. This is increasing number of paddocks. This is percent of the growing season that the plant is in recovery. We see most of the recovery benefit comes in the first 10 paddocks. So why do we go out to 20, 30, 40, 50, 103 paddocks? Because there's a lot of other good stuff that happens with the shortened grazing periods other than just allowing for a longer recovery period. More consistency in utilization, nutrient intake, they eat weeds, they spread the manure appropriately, it's all good. And all these things together increase carrying capacity, that variability in recovery period. This is days of recovery and the accumulated yield. And all it's saying is in fast growing conditions, when we have ample water, recovery periods, or whatever days it said, if we have less water, slower rate of growth, we've got to have a longer recovery period, because it's how long does it take it to grow those additional leaves. Create surface litter, already talked about that. Overly severe grazing can remove litter from the surface, and if you always eat every blade of grass, you can't even begin to build the litter, let alone keep it there. We don't need to do that one because that's a dry land deal. I think, one of the things I remember from Missouri in like the drought of 1988 was we had a whole lot of places that had grass standing in them, but we had no water. The ponds were all dried out. And in this part of the country, not having stock water because your ponds are dry, that does limit your opportunity to use that land. So rehydrating your landscape, I just hate it when I see an animal actually going directly to a pond. We can protect the volume of water, the quality of water, so much better if we have those fenced out. That's just not a healthy state for water quality, for the integrity of ponds, anything like that. See what they do there. All right, filter strips along the stream channel. One of the last projects that came across my plate in the last years I was in Missouri was stiff stem grass hedges. And I didn't actually get involved with that. I don't know where it went. So things like prairie cordgrass, switchgrass, and the research that was out there said that what did it say? A 6 foot wide strip of like prairie cordgrass or switchgrass had as much filtration effect as a 100 foot or 60 foot filter strip of something like orchard grass or grown grass. Keyline plowing. I'm not an equipment guy, but this is one of the few tools that I have seen that actually seems to make a difference. There's not a lot of research to support the keyline plowing, but I've been on enough properties that have done it. And so the keyline plow, or the yeoman plow, it's based on ripping the ground, following. Some people say it's dead level, and that's the key line. I've also heard it described in Australia as the lowest gradient at which water will move horizontally through gravity. I'm not sure which it is, but what it does, it sets up a whole series of infiltration opportunities and breaks overland flow of water. It's expensive, but my perspective is it is effective. And then level terraces. Terraces on farmland are designed to get water off of the field. Level terraces are designed to back water up, to slow the movement of water down slope, increase infiltration. This is something that I've seen done with a 1 or 2 bottom moldboard plow. That's all it is. It isn't, heavy equipment, scrapers and dozers and all that. So some people do it that way, but if you're in a grassland like the top picture there, just running that level contour of a single furrow turn can substantially break the flow of water and increase infiltration. And the last thing here is have that plan, and flexible stocking rates are important, and then the ability to liquidate an enterprise without breaking the bank. It can break your heart, I don't care, but you don't want it to break the bank. And I don't have any books to sell, but these always have a book at. You can visit us at American Grazing Lands, and there is a brochure for our family business, American Grazing Lands there, so you can know how to get in contact with me or with us. Do we have any time for questions, or have I exceeded it?
Nope, we're right at 12 o'clock, so.
Man,